Hello and welcome to Fadima's online discussion about the COVID-19 impact to the bakery sector. I'm Steve Gillman, an agri-food journalist for IHS Markit based in Brussels, and I'll be guiding us through today's conversation, which of course is coming at a very pivotal point in time. COVID-19 has triggered a global recession, the worst in the EU's history, worse than the financial crisis of 2008. It continues to send economic ripple effects across the world, reshaping marketplaces and consumer behaviour in the process. The food service industry, a key sector for bakery companies, was effectively shut down for many months and now operates at a reduced capacity. Meanwhile, millions of consumers were stuck at home and many more face a reduced household income, both of which have had a profound impact on their consumer behaviour, seeing a range of trends emerge from a demand in prepared goods to a greater shift towards e-commerce. And the pandemic, unfortunately for all of us, does not look like it's going away anytime soon. Social distancing measures remain in place throughout the world, and it is no idea when these measures will be lifted up. And with that comes uncertainty, risking further economic havoc. But the EU hopes to mobilise €750 billion over the next 7 years to help the bloc emerge safely from this economic downturn. The Commission wants this recovery to not only be about the economy and society, but also about the environment. This summer, Europe faced another season of record-breaking temperatures, which disrupted production across several key agricultural sectors, including wheat and oilseed producers. And the consumers noticed this too. Different organisations reported a strong demand for sustainability throughout Europe, which maintained during the pandemic. That's a lot of market forces for the bakery sector to deal with at once, and it's no surprise that the European Commission hasn't let the sustainability of the agri-food system fall off its agenda. It launched its Farm to Fork strategy in May, which is a set of policies that they hope will shape more sustainable agri-food chains from production to consumption. It includes policies like an ambitious target to reduce the use and risk of pesticides by 50% over the next 10 years, as well as more consumer-facing ones like introducing a mandatory front-of-pack nutritional labelling scheme. So, how can the bakery sector deal with all this at once? It raises a lot of questions. How will consumer behaviour evolve going forward? Has COVID-19 fundamentally changed the marketplace? And how can businesses thrive in this new normal? And then we have the bigger picture question. How can we manage an economic recovery while increasing sustainability ambition, all the while during an ongoing pandemic? Today, we'll hear from a range of distinguished experts to try and get a few answers. First, we'll hear from Fadima's president, Johan Sanders, on how the sector has responded to COVID-19. After that, I'll move to the panelists for an opening remark. We'll first hear from Blaga Papova, Food Policy Officer from the European Commission's Division for the Internal Market, otherwise known as DG GROW. She'll talk about the Commission's response to COVID-19 and touch upon the Farm to Fork strategy. Then we'll hear from Els Bedert, Head of Product Policy at EuroCommerce, the European organisation representing the retail and wholesale sector. And finally, we'll hear from Robb MacKie, CEO and President of the American Bakers Association, about how the US market has responded to COVID-19. Then we'll start a panelist debate where I'll put some questions to the different speakers to dig a bit deeper into the topic. Before I open the floor to you, the audience, you can submit your own questions on the Q&A page that the conference organisers sent you ahead of this debate. I'll be following it here and pick the best ones to put to the panelists. And I'll also read out your name and association if it's included. So, without further delay, I'll pass the floor to Johan Sanders, President of Fadima, for his opening remark. Johan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. So last week we had a roundtable with the CEOs of our companies in the Fadima area. And we discussed, based on some market research data and some internal observations, what do we see as major trends as a result of this COVID crisis. Some elements go up, some elements go down, and you can see that in this slide. So the first thing we want to acknowledge is that we are all maybe not surprised, but really happy to see that we have a high agility and motivation of our workers to cope with these changed environment. So that's something to be proud of as an industry. But if you look outside of our own industry, let's say our own companies, we see some trends. The first trend is home baking. So I think you all remember in the first weeks that flour on the supermarket shelves was gone because people started to do home baking. We see that families are going to buy bigger brands, so they go for less specialized products. Online shopping, you all have also shopped more online than ever before. But then again, if we go to our own industry, you see that people are scared a little bit to buy fresh products. Is it touched by somebody? Is the virus on it? So packed products and long life products are really growing at this moment. What we see as a decline, and I think it's not a surprise because there's less travel, people don't go to the office. So food service as a segment, as a channel segment is really showing the largest decline. Secondly, what we see is that, as I told you, the consumers are confused about fresh products. So they switch a little bit between fresh products and long life products. And in our industry, we see that there is a decline in bread, in patisserie and sweet. And we predict that the bread consumption is declining, but the real decline will be and for a longer time, will be in patisserie and viennoiserie. And all this has to do with a change in purchasing power. I think we have not really seen the economical crisis, but people are saving money, and in a way, therefore, they spend less money. So these are the high over trends, and let's look in the next slide to some of our challenges. So first of all, one of the key challenges, and it's a good example today, is the COVID measures and restrictions across member states is totally different. So if I travel from Belgium to Germany, measures are different, and that makes doing business more complicated. Because of this economical crisis, we will see increased competition, and that will affect us all. And one of the key elements we all are worried and busy with is we need to ensure employee safety and social distance at work. How are we going to do that? What is the consequence of having less social interaction? And as explained, this safety issue, or the perceived safety issue, it needs that we need to educate, or one of the opportunities is to educate people why fresh bakery products or bake-off products are not bad or not dangerous. So another element is innovation. We see that customers are so busy with day-to-day business that new innovations or new products are less relevant. But it's not only the products, but also how do we do innovations? How do we communicate in this new normal? And then finally, in the whole chain, we will see disruption. We will see potential partners going bankrupt. And this again will disrupt and will challenge us as an industry. So high over, I've given you an overview of the trends and some of the challenges we see as Fedima. So thank you.
Great, thanks Johan. I think that was a very useful scene setter for the panelist discussion. But before then, I'm going to pass to each speaker for their introductory remarks. First up, it's Blaga Papova from the European Commission. Blaga, can you tell us what's the Commission's take on the COVID-19 impact to the internal market so far?
For the kind invitation for today.
Blaga, could you please turn on your microphone?
It's on.
Oh,
it's turned on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, excellent. So what I was saying, first of all, thank you for the invitation for today. It's a pleasure to be with you. The Commission response, I will first start by talking a little bit what we did in our department at the beginning of the crisis, which is indeed the Department for Internal Market, Industry, and in my case, specifically focusing on the food industry and its competitiveness. So already in March, we started by opening a direct communication channel with business operators as well as their representatives to understand in real time what were the problems they were facing so that we can react accordingly and rapidly. The first thing to react on, perhaps the most pressing for us was indeed preserving the integrity and the proper functioning of the internal market. It was mentioned that serious disruptions took place, bottlenecks, long waiting time at borders, a little bit of a different response in different parts of Europe. So we had to make sure that this is more coordinated and done as fast as possible. So already in mid-March, the Commission issued guidelines on border measures. And shortly after, and perhaps even more importantly, we set out guidance for setting up of green lanes, just to make sure that there are priority lanes for goods to flow freely, and especially essential goods as medicines and, of course, food. And we received actually immediate feedback that that has helped a lot. We saw some alleviation at what we call the hotspots in some parts of Central and Eastern Europe, but also at, let's say, the Italian-Austrian border. So that helped, but of course, some disruption unfortunately remained. So we set up a permanent channel contact point network with border authorities. This is about the logistics. Let's say also at a very higher political level, our commissioner, Thierry Breton, who is responsible for the internal market, he was also constantly on the phone with the ministers in the different countries to try and directly communicate the necessity to solve issues quickly. But as I said, it was not only about transport as logistics. We analyzed the impact on the economy more comprehensively, and we received signals, a lot of which were in fact already mentioned by Jochen, problems sometimes into receiving the necessary inputs, but also adapting to this unprecedented situation with new costs, higher costs, social distancing, new hygiene measures, need for testing, ensuring the safety of your workers, and reacted accordingly. Talking about workers, of course, the question of the movement, free movement of workers was also an issue, particularly for agriculture, sometimes also for food industry in cross-border factory workers. So there was also a guidance on free movement of essential workers, and food workers were mentioned specifically in this occasion. Now, going back at the overall economic response, we started immediately with an economic recovery package. First of all, we mobilized, I would say, existing instruments and existing funding to make it easier for member states to deploy it. There was the flexibility on state aid for immediate support. And we also realized that there was urgent need for injecting liquidity. In the food sector, we noticed that while the food supply chain has continued to function, and I think indeed we should be proud of that, and we are very thankful to food operators for the resilience and the adaptability, that was not without pain, it was not without disruption, and we've seen also a drop in demand for food products, especially those linked to HoReCa or more specialty products, for example. So the broader economic response, as I said, included allowing for more liquidity, guarantees for easier loans, but also grants. For the common agricultural policy, also the rules were made more flexible, so funding can come quickly, more easily, and there was also a temporary measure to provide lump sum payments not only to farmers but also to small food processing companies of up to 50,000 euros. The list is actually even longer, but for the sake of time, I will perhaps stop here. And of course, all this culminated with the EU recovery package and the 750 billion mentioned by Steve. Now, what is particularly important now is how this money is going to be spent, because of course it's again the member countries, the national authorities who will decide on the priorities, but we will oversee that these priorities take into account the most pressing issues. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Blaga. You touched upon the resilience of the food sector in some parts, but I wonder, what do you think are the future risks going towards the internal market, considering, unfortunately, the pandemic does not look like it's going to be leaving us anytime soon?
Indeed, as I mentioned, I think one of the things that we've realized during the pandemic is a reminder of the value, of the importance of a well-functioning, a well-integrated internal market, and how the supply chains are really connected. So the internal market should be a motor for recovery. But we have noticed that in some countries, let's call them COVID response measures, were introduced that could potentially have a disruptive effect on the internal market or discriminate towards foreign goods. We had cases in Central and Eastern Europe where proposals were made to give preference to local products in supermarkets, or oblige retail to sell preferentially a certain parts and provide preferential space within shops to local products. So we had to immediately react, get in contact with the authorities, and make sure that whatever they do is in fact not against the rules of the internal market. But we are looking at this, of course, more holistically. So we have.
Blaga, I think that will cover it. I think we're going to really touch upon protective measures quite a lot today. So, but thank you. That was very insightful. Next, I'd like to turn to Els Bedert from EuroCommerce for another insider's point of view of what happened to the European food market during COVID-19. Els, what has your association learned about COVID's impact to the retail sector?
Thank you very much, Steve. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Again, also thank you for inviting me to this General Assembly. I'm looking forward to the discussions. Maybe a few words about our sector. So I represent EuroCommerce, and as the European Federation for Retail and Wholesale. Our sector is quite diverse. There's a lot of different business models, ranging from very small convenience stores, local stores, up to supermarkets, hypermarkets, omnichannel, and also pure players like the marketplaces. And it's also an important sector for the European economy. 1 in 7 jobs is in distribution in 1 in 4 businesses, and we contribute about 10% of the European GDP. So, of course, our sector, due to the nature of its business, it's about predicting sales and making sure that the consumers have access to the products that the choice and the type of products that they wish at all times, basically. And we have set up, of course, very, very extensive processes and quality systems to actually make that happen in real life. And this is running quite nicely. And then, of course, COVID happened. And then you have to sort of reinvent the way you work. But maybe just a few, before I go into the food retail, maybe just a few words about the non-food, because as you know, the impact on the retail sector was quite different according to the types of products that you sell. And the non-food part, our non-food members are particularly hard hit with the closure, and with people not just buying or delaying buying stuff. So what the fallout would be in the end is probably too early to tell still, especially if some of the recovery measures will stop. I think in Germany it was even predicted that about 50,000 businesses might never reopen. So it could be considerable. The other section is the wholesale, and Blaga already touched on this as well. The food wholesale, of course, supplying HoReCa and the food service sector, it just came to a halt, and also there they have been hit quite hard, and indeed with a lot of different products staying on the market. On food retail itself, maybe briefly, 3 different points I would like to make is, first of all, on the supply chain. Of course, it was mentioned indeed, you had some panic buying in the beginning. We all know, and we've all seen the jokes about toilet paper, I'm sure. But all of a sudden, all our predictions about sales just, could go into the waste basket, and we had to sort of really look into making sure the shelves were kept full with what the consumers were expecting. And actually that was the biggest thing that we were meeting. I mean, making sure that the stocks were replenished in store so that people could get what they wanted. And that meant shifting around even staff from headquarters to the shop floor, for example. Of course, it was mentioned that you also had the border blockages, which affected as well. So in some cases, you had to look for different suppliers, and we were very pleased with the response of the Commission that reacted very quickly on that. So the supply chain, there were no shortages in the end, but we were all challenged and stretched. And I think it really, for the supply chain as a whole, it showed that we can, together we can actually overcome these issues. The second thing, briefly, on the health and safety. Of course, for us, very important for our staff, but also for the customers. The food stores stayed open, but in the beginning, staff were, of course, very concerned about their own health. And of course, the consumers, the citizens, were very not comfortable going into stores. So we had to put into place a lot of different measures that you've all seen, because you all go to shops and you've seen the disinfecting at the entrance, maybe the limiting the number of people in store, having physical barriers between the cashier and all these measures. So they were the issue was that they were all very different in the different member states and in different regions. So it was a big learning curve for our members, but they're here to stay now, and I think we've all found a sort of a modus operandi which is comfortable for the customers and for the staff. And the last part was, of course, a different way to shop. I mean, it's people moving to e-commerce was mentioned, and also home delivery. Those members that already had an online presence could actually respond, although sometimes with very huge delays as well, because they were over demanded basically. But those that were not online had to sort of make a backup plan, and really adapt themselves very quickly. And apart from the online sales, it's also an issue that people shop more locally, and also the way that, maybe less frequently. So when they went to a shop, they were buying different stuff and bigger baskets. And so there were lots of things that were how people are shopping are changed during the crisis. We, as a sector, very much depend on consumer confidence. I mean, this is when consumer confidence is down, it is felt immediately in the sales. And we can, of course, say that people are still very unsure about the future, and some more layoffs or unemployment will probably happen this year, and also the second year. And like I said, with some of the measures being stopped. So this translates completely in what people are buying. But maybe a good thing for us, if we can say, if something came out of the crisis, that there is the appreciation for the sector and for the distribution sector and the role it plays for the European economy, and how it drives the European economy as well. And we are also very pleased to see that in this recovery plan, retail was.
Els. That's
yes?
very, very insightful. Finally, I'd like to turn to Robb MacKie, President and CEO of the American Bakers Association. Firstly, Robb, thank you for waking up at a very early hour in the morning to come to us all the way from the east coast of the US. Can you tell us how the US bakery sector has been affected by COVID-19, please? Robb, can you please unmute yourself if you haven't done so yet?
You would think after 6 months of COVID, we would figure out how to unmute ourselves. Let me just say thank you. It's great to be with you again. Johan and Steve, thank you for having me. it's an amazing experience over the last 7 months. I think it really is important that the food industry, and particularly the baking industry, has responded as it always does in times of crisis. The baking industry is essential to feeding our countries, and we have stepped up in ways that I don't think we could ever have anticipated before. I think it's very important that when COVID hit, the industry very quickly rallied. I mean, day one, and for the most part, the industry has been working throughout the entire pandemic and will continue to do so. But the mission was really clear. The mission was feed the country, make sure that we were producing healthy, safe products for the country and our communities. It was protecting our essential employees who, without their help, those frontline employees, we could not produce product, we could not keep the facilities running, we could not distribute product to grocery stores. The last thing was, as we've talked about, the food service sector, you know, and it's really important in the United States, you know, 52% of meals are consumed or used to be consumed out of the home. So 52% of the market basically went away overnight, and that created enormous challenges. So for those bakers, we have been working very hard to find relief and government relief packages and all of that. I think it's really interesting in terms of our position, and maybe a little bit different than in the EU. We very quickly, literally day one, banded together with 52 other food and beverage supply chain organizations from farm to fork to really step into the void to make sure that we were, again, fulfilling that mission of feeding the country. And it was a lot of cases where we developed our own protocols. And as you can imagine, in our very litigious society in the United States, that created some, you know, eyebrows. But we figured we needed to step into the breach, particularly before the government could put out their protocols. And so we essentially went to the White House, to the Food and Drug Administration, and said, we've got this. You need to focus on what you need to do on the medical side. And when you're ready, we can then talk about, you know, tweaking protocols. So we developed over a dozen different protocols in terms of how to produce products safely, how to protect our essential employees. One of the big asks that we went to again, to the top levels of government is we needed a lot of flexibility around regulation, around enforcement. But the trade-off for that was we knew as an industry, we needed to fulfill our responsibility and our obligation to produce safe and healthy products. And so very quickly, the Food and Drug Administration accepted our request to pause any regulation and to pull regulations that would have minimal impact, as well as reducing, unless there was a cause, inspections in food and food manufacturing facilities. And that has been enormously helpful in terms of protecting the employees, but allowing us to respond with this vastly different marketplace, and again, making sure that we can feed the country. The other thing is, you know, we have spent a lot of time looking at the market. As we've talked about, you know, the market was turned upside down, and we saw, like Els talked about, we saw all that same sort of panic buying going on here in the United States as well. And one of the things that we have worked very hard on is how can we reprogram the food service distribution and supply chain to make it more applicable in the retail side. And it was not without some challenges, and we had some bottlenecks clearly in the supply chain. But again, the supply chain has been very resilient. And so, you know, we've been very proud of the work that we have done in terms of keeping the country fed. Looking forward, we are working to make sure that when vaccines become available, just like with personal protective equipment, just like with sanitizers and other items, that the food industry is high on the priority list for access to those resources. Because if we don't get access, then we do worry that the food supply chain will start to break down. And one of my proudest moments is when we had a conversation with the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Commissioner, Stephen Hahn, who just said, we were so appreciative that the food industry just stepped in, without having to be asked, without asking for permission. The food industry just stepped up and fulfilled its responsibility and obligation. So I think going forward, we need to build on that. We have this renewed trust. We have this new, and particularly as bakers, and all of the growth at home baking and this sort of reconnection with consumers. The fundamental question that I believe we have as we start to get through the back end, hopefully, of COVID, and hopefully sooner rather than later, how do we build on that momentum that we have? How do we build on that trust with consumers and government officials?
Great. Thanks, Rob. I think you've teed up the panel discussion very well to dig a bit deeper into this topic. We heard a lot of interesting points there that I think could certainly be elaborated on. And we also heard early on Johan talk about increased competition in the bakery sector and potentially more protective measures emerging in member states. So I'm curious what you guys think businesses could do to succeed in this context on both sides of the Atlantic. So first, I'd like to turn to Blaga to hear what she thinks.
What should business do to succeed, right? That was the question. Steve.
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
The question was, what should business do to succeed, right, in these unprecedented times?
That's it, yes.
Well, I think I will leave most of that question to my fellow panelists, but just two things. I think it's really important to keep a dialogue and have a collaborative approach within the supply chain, but also beyond the supply chain. In fact, when we were analyzing the COVID response, we didn't look anymore just at sectors. We looked at what we call ecosystems. So in the case of the agri-food ecosystem, it would go beyond the food supply chain and touch upon other systems such as tourism and hospitality, retail, and so on. So the type of collaboration between those different sectors as part of one ecosystem, I think, can bring about really good opportunities. And we had some examples actually, and Els is probably aware of wholesalers who really supported, for example, their clients in hospitality and even were implicated into the setup of the hygiene protocols. So this, let's say, holistic or ecosystem approach and finding common projects, I think, is a good way forward. And another thing that was also mentioned is really important, consumer trust. So communicating to consumers, really making them aware that food is safe and we can guarantee the highest standard for quality and safety.
Great, thanks very much. And on the issue of increased competition throughout member states, maybe that's something Els would like to come in on.
Thank you very much. I would just like to refer to our asks, which we has also communicated to Commissioner Breton, this digital presence and the digital transformation. I think this is very important also to move beyond your own country where you're present, and we've called for a lot of support in that, to be present there, to also on the skills level to make sure that small businesses or businesses in general can access this digital market as well. And secondly, this trend of sustainability has accelerated during the lockdown. People with more appreciation for sustainability and health issues related to food. So I think for businesses in general, so not linked to one particular member state, but to have your place in the market, is that you have to sort of keep on focusing or move on that train, on the sustainability train, as this is where you can differentiate.
Great, thanks very much. And I think it'd be interesting to hear the US perspective. Rob, could you share your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think it's been interesting that we've got a little bit different dynamic going on in the United States, where a lot of the sustainability initiatives have been put on hold. And I think some of them are being reevaluated. A great example is, the move towards plastic food bags and a lot of our localities and even some of our states were moving to outright ban them. And as we have seen, consumers are very reluctant to buy a product that's not packaged. I think Johan did a great job of explaining that. And so we've seen a reevaluation of some of those efforts in terms of plastic packaging of all kinds, because it is a critical defense in food safety, particularly at this moment. I would say in order to be successful, I've referred to COVID as being an accelerant on a lot of trends. I would say health and wellness is clearly one of them. And I talked about building on the momentum of this renewed connection that we have with consumers. Part of that is the baking industry and the food industry is going to have to meet consumers kind of where they are. And by that, I mean, we need to be looking at, the number of SKUs, products that we put out. But we also need to look at the serious health and wellness trends that are out there, and how do we as bakers, meet those consumers' needs. I think that's going to be a huge issue going forward. Just as using food is kind of a preventative, a food biotic, if you will, just for general chronic issues. And so I think that's something that bakers are going to have to do. I think the workforce challenges that we've had are going to accelerate process improvements, whether it's new equipment or things like that. So I think there's a host of changes coming that bakers are going to need to really stay ahead of.
Great. That's very interesting and tees up the next question quite well. We heard a lot about consumer behavior changing there in terms of sustainability and food and health and well-being. So how can businesses capture this value in a COVID world? I think, Rob, actually, let's go back to you and hear what your thoughts are there.
Sure. I think that's one of those things where I'm going to be very interested, with this renewed connection that the industry has with consumers. It's really around, obviously health and wellness, but also, the sense that baking is essential part of the diet and a healthy lifestyle. And let's just be honest, even with this group, everybody will admit in December, even January, there was a lot of hand wringing going on about lost sales, declining volumes, and in the bakery category. And so I think, again, there's a renewed confidence and there's a renewed interest on the part of baking that we need to build on.
Great, and I think it'd be interesting to get the European perspective on innovation and how businesses can capture this value. Els, could you share your thoughts on this question, please?
Well, I can only agree. I mean, we have to follow the consumer here, and the consumer, this is who we serve. So we see this, the trends, the sale trends, and you have to move along those lines. And the problem is, of course, with for the moment, there's still consumer trust is still low. It's still a lot of insecurity. So how long that will remain, and what it would mean actually for sales is difficult to predict how long it will stay like that. We have seen that consumers actually they go for the lower range categories as well, with not for the most expensive part. So, but it's clear. I mean, this home cooking and people working from home for much more often and eating out less. I think there is absolutely a trend to really acknowledge and to work with. And like I said, we as retail, we see what the consumer is asking, and indeed that's where the important cooperation goes within the supply chain, that we work with our supplier and that we are able to respond to this question or this need, this demand from the consumer.
Great, and I actually have a follow-up for you. We've heard sustainability mentioned a lot in terms of consumer behavior. Who do you think has to pay for sustainability going forward? Are we going to increase prices for consumers? Should it be businesses? Should it be farmers? Or where should responsibility fall?
Well, I mean, that's of course a very difficult question. Everybody has to be part of this transition, and some have more cost than others. And we've also been advocating for enough real support measures, for example, to the farmers. If you talk about farm to fork, it's clear that there's support needed to make a transition, for example, on organics. But for us on the retail sector, of course, if the scale changes, if there's more sustainable products available, then of course the prices will drop. So it's also easier for consumers to actually access these products. But it's a shared responsibility. And of course, if you talk about the food product itself, then there's a lot to be done either the production side or the manufacturing side if you want to reformulate. But you also have to think about the whole way that business is conducted and all the other bigger picture related to sustainability, such as energy consumption. And this is where all businesses have a need to get their do their investments and contribute.
Great, thanks. I think you certainly highlighted the challenge of sustainability
Steve,
going forward. We also saw the emergence of e-commerce a lot more for consumers, and I'm curious how prepared the single market is to incorporate a greater shift to e-commerce. Blaga, would you be able to touch upon that for us, please?
Yeah, certainly. Perhaps to echo a little bit what the other speakers mentioned about capturing the opportunities of e-commerce for the food sector, because what we have seen is a trend that started already before COVID, that online food sales were really one of the fastest growing segments in e-commerce in Europe, but also an unexploited segment, perhaps the smallest amongst consumer goods. And there were different reasons behind that, and also differences in the different countries in Europe. To a certain extent, it may also be linked to culture. In some countries like Spain, it was relatively common, but for example, in Eastern Europe, it was not something that people would do every day. So really to jump into opportunity, I guess from the side of business, changing business models would also require a stable regulatory framework that we are working on. And for food, there is always the need for broadband access in rural areas if we want to make this access universal. So a lot of opportunities there, but really I think that we have to, and businesses as well, have to have a more long-term strategy to jump on the train and capture the opportunities of this new and growing trend.
Great, thanks. Very insightful. I've still got a couple of questions for the panelists, but I'd just like to remind the audience, if they have anything else, please do submit them, and I'm sure I'll put them, as many as I can, to the speakers when we reach that part of the discussion. So I think we're all very well aware of how the food sector was hit particularly hard by the pandemic and remains vulnerable going forward. So now let's talk about the needed long-term support to address the loss and reduce capacity of the food service industry. I'd like first to turn to Els. Els, what do you think is needed to help the food service sector going forward?
Yeah, if you talk about food service, of course you mean the restaurant and HoReCa part, which is, I must say, not part of our membership. But for us, it's I think that the European GDP is 50% based on private consumption that determines the GDP. So I think there's a lot of, we need to stimulate consumption. We need to make sure that there's also that the citizens have enough money to spend, basically. And I think there are some actions also in different member states to make sure that people can still go out and spend some money. But if you look at the food service, I mean, it's all about feeling safe where you are. There's still different measures, so we do hope that the council will actually agree on some common criteria also about restrictive measures and travel, and that will also help in opening up some of the food service sector. But lots of them are SMEs, so they actually have a problem with liquidity, and I think Blaga already mentioned it. So it's going to need long-term support. It's going to not just now. They're going to need some longer-term support to remain open, and the skills. I mean, the whole digital transformation that we just talked about counts for everybody, and there's still a skills gap, I think, within the workers or the businesses. So we, in the skills agenda of the European Commission, there should also be a lot of attention to that.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Els. I'm sure Rob has some insight there of how the help is needed for the US. Rob, can you share your thoughts, please?
No, absolutely, and I think this is a big topic, and I think the short term is to just do everything that we can to make sure that the food service supply chain is supported, and so that's why we've been working with a lot of the government programs, the CARES Act, the PPP program, and things like that. But to be brutally honest about it, the thing that's going to have the most impact is, besides that confidence of consumers to go out and eat again, is the most robust economic recovery we have ever had in our history. We have just seen record unemployment. We have seen, incomes have declined dramatically. And while there's some green shoots here in the United States, it needs to be the broadest, quickest economic recovery we've ever had. Here in the United States, that will require, tax reform, regulatory reform, any of those friction items that slow down business are going to be absolutely essential. We talked about sustainability earlier and the cost of sustainability. I think promoting those things that actually are good for the environment, good for our communities and ecosystems, but also are good for the business, are going to be enormously helpful. So I think it's a broad brush focus on economic growth is then going to really then help, because we're already seeing many similarities to the financial meltdown in the late 2000s, and in terms of buying patterns. Until consumers feel confident that they've got a stable job, I think there's going to be great reluctance, on top of the sort of psychological issue about whether they feel comfortable going into a restaurant, feeling comfortable getting on an airplane and traveling, going to a sporting event, all of these different venues.
Thanks, Rob. We certainly have noticed the challenge in Europe of aligning different member states to introduce the same measures to address the pandemic. So I'm wondering, Blaga, can you touch upon the challenges going forward to do that, to ensure that the food service sector is protected, but as well as all the other key markets for bakery companies, please?
Yeah, definitely. I think we are all aware of how close is the link between the HoReCa sector and the food sector. And it was already mentioned that food service was not only hardly hit, but the recovery is unfortunately also going to be slower. It was estimated that it may take up to 18 to 24 months, but this is just a forecast. So it can be even longer. And there are those who are operating and who manage to reopen, they are operating at limited capacity, which may get worse in the winter. So definitely support is needed now on the public side. From the Commission, we are coming up with a strategy. There was in May a specific guidance again for reopening tourism, including safety protocols for food service that later on served as a basis also for countries adopting their own protocols. These were minimum requirements, but I'm sure we will all recognize them today in our daily life. The distance between tables, hygiene rules, no buffets and things like that. So of course, the member countries where they have more competences on the ground also had specific schemes to support the restaurants. And these included tax incentives and also subsidizing demand. And I totally agree with Rob that demand is really important, restoring confidence. One example is in the UK. They had this voucher system to get people going back to restaurants, and we have different examples in Europe. So I think there is a little bit of optimism over there, but we have to be careful that with the new season, it doesn't actually get worse. So jump on your opportunities. We talked about digital and e-commerce. So we've seen actually an increase also in food delivery. became more and more common, and I think we really have to manage that also properly to make sure that restaurants get a proper opportunity in their collaboration with delivery platforms, but also that delivery becomes more sustainable. So going back on the sustainability issue, and that is also valid for food e-commerce in general and any type of growing e-commerce. Paying attention to the last mile, paying attention as well to packaging. I am totally in line with the fact that consumers are looking for more packaging, but we also have to think of what type of packaging. Is it sustainable packaging? And maybe tap more into the innovation opportunities that we have for changing things in that direction.
Great, thank you very much. We've certainly heard a lot about sustainability again, and also about recovery, which tees up the bigger picture question very well. How can we best balance higher EU sustainability ambition with an economic recovery during an ongoing pandemic? And then what does a green recovery look like for the bakery sector? So first, maybe I'll go back to Blaga to kind of take the bigger picture question, and then I'll go to the other two for the green recovery for the bakery sector. Blaga?
Yeah, that's indeed a tough question, but it's an indispensable question. I think it's clear to everybody that it will not be a real recovery if it is not a green and sustainable recovery. Because if this shift to the post-COVID world is not done sustainably, then a new crisis is looming, and it's gonna hit us, and it's already there, the climate crisis. So as from the policy side, we're of course very attentive to the sensitivities, the economic needs of operators, including, of course, food operators. The EU budget has been increased specifically for support for the green and digital transition. So that will be a big one. But I think everybody has to come into this new mindset that whatever changes are made within the recovery, they have to be with a long-term thinking, obviously taking into account the pressing problems, but also with a medium to long-term vision.
Great, thanks very much. I think you've teed it up nicely to dig it into the sector a bit more. So before we narrow down to the bakery sector, let's see retail and wholesale point of view. Els, can you give us your take on balancing the economic recovery with increased sustainability ambition?
I'll try to, but it's indeed a really hard question. It was quite interesting to hear that in the US there's less policy pressure during the COVID. I think we have had a very, very, very busy summer to deal with all the consultations to prepare for more sustainability and including the farm to fork. So yeah, does it help? I mean, like I said, we see it as a trend that has accelerated, that there is an increasing demand, and we have to capture that. I mean, we cannot go back on in a timeline. We have a plan, we have a long-term vision, and it's now is the time, I think. But of course, true. I mean, there is a cost, and if there is a crisis, it's going to be double hard. What is the solution? Luckily, I don't have a business myself. I think there's a lot of challenges, but this is the only way forward. And I think that the consumers have also indicated that very clearly. And I do hope that the businesses do find the room and the space, the financial space, but also the whole space of the mind with all this crisis and its own security to actually go into that, because it does require a lot of R&D. If you especially look at the food manufacturing, of course, if you look at the food product itself, I mean, you need to be sure that the investments that you do will actually have some return. So I can imagine it's uncertain times for everybody. I can only hope that indeed with the change that we have seen with the consumers, that this is something that businesses are willing to jump on.
That's great, Els. I think that's a really, really good answer to pose the challenges facing the economy, and And to maybe dig a bit deeper into the European bakery sector, Johan, would you like to share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the whole sustainability challenges is quite interesting, and I think Fedimao as an industry, we can play a role there. So as you heard from at the first part of this session, we have set up a sustainability committee, and one of the elements, and we need to work it out, is the packaging element. And today, as you see, the whole industry has a fragmented packaging solution. So we make it very difficult in the supply chain to minimize packaging. So what can we do as industry to optimize our packaging so that in the supply chain we have less waste? Another element is we have seen that consumers are scared now. So they move to packed food, which is actually, from a packaging point of view, let's say from a sustainability point of view, I should say, going the wrong way. So what we again can do all together, and Fedimar can play a role, or will play a role, is to inform consumers about food safety. So is a fresh product from a baker unpacked safe or not safe? And we can play a role to inform opinion leaders so that consumers feel more, let's say, safe to buy fresh products. So I think there's also some very tactical elements the industry can do together to inform and to change the supply chain of our industry.
I think that's a very nice EU perspective of the challenge. But what about the US? Rob, can you share your thoughts on this last section of the panel?
No, I think it's very important, and I would agree with Johan. There's these competing tensions going on that have been exacerbated by the COVID situation, where for food safety reasons, we're seeing a greater reliance on plastic packaging, and I just don't know what the long-term impact of that is. So what we have done as a food industry and frankly a consumer products industry in the United States is we're really trying to work with both federal and state leaders on the recycling infrastructure and some of those things that could be helpful in terms of, working on renewable plastics, or not renewable plastics, but, in terms of recycling plastics. But there's a lot of tension here. And the concern that we've got is, at what point is the consumer going to stop buying products? What's the price point that consumers are going? Is it 2%, 5%? And that's why I come back to, I think we need to partner with both federal and state agencies in terms of coming up with economically viable solutions and deadlines that balance that. We're very blessed here in the United States that we've got one of the lowest per capita spending on food and beverages in the world, and but that's also very price sensitive. And so how can we implement energy savings? How can we implement recycling and package reduction? And probably the biggest issue that could have the most impact is how do we eliminate or reduce food waste? There's a lot of food that doesn't, and it's hard to imagine, but there's a lot of food that isn't consumed. That's going to have to be part of the solution as well. So I think there's these very competing tensions, and in a time when the global economy is really struggling, it's going to be very hard to add additional cost without convincing and coming up with solutions that are going to be cost effective and have as Els said, a shorter ROI, return on investment.
Great, thanks, Rob. I think this has certainly painted an interesting context for global trade as well. And I'm curious how you guys think this will evolve going forward with the pandemic also still here to stay. So we've got a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm going to go to the first one, which is about this trade aspect. Do you think the COVID-19 situation will make European countries see the agri-food sector as more of a strategic industry to protect? And then maybe I'll move to Rob eventually for the geopolitical consequences of such actions. So maybe first we'll go to Blaga to get her thoughts.
I think there are two aspects when it comes to international trade. First of all, we know that the EU is a big player in international trade. We are integrated in international supply chains, and we are actually the biggest exporter of food. So clearly the closing of borders with the rest of the world has brought a negative impact and kind of reshuffling of looking at new channels for EU food exporters. But of course, we have to balance that with a certain need for food security. The thing is that from our point of view, we don't see a big issue for the time being of food security in the EU. So we will keep our trade policy open, but we are of course very mindful to sensitive sectors. And one of those sensitive sectors is indeed agriculture. So within all EU free trade negotiations, agriculture always gets particularly special treatment. So I think we have to balance both, knowing also that now with COVID, there has been an increase in demand for local products. So I think the two trends are there at the same time. So consumers, on one hand, they are demanding local, and that will bring a boost to local producers. But we have to be careful, I would say, not to fall into the protectionist trap, because as I said, we are open economies, and if we take into account the sensitivities of certain sectors, I think we can really make trade work, including food trade, but definitely with caution.
Okay, I just have a quick follow-up because another audience member asked about local and protectionist measures. This is from Enric Valls from Puratos. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But he's asking about the protectionist measures, if local could be interpreted as such. So he's wondering, how is the EU acting on ensuring that local agri-food policies don't create an imbalance to the internal market? And that's for Blaga.
Clearly, I already mentioned some national measures that we are constantly monitoring, specifically in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in other parts of Europe where we have seen politicians openly, how should I say, inciting consumers to buy local food. For us, the EU market is one market, so it's a priority for us to make sure that if there is a demand for local, consumers also understand that what local is, because I have to say that there can be some misperceptions. We sometimes think that local also means the best quality and also means the more sustainable product because it's close to us. But unfortunately, this is actually not always the case. I mean, tomatoes that are produced with a high energy intensity close to your home may have a higher environmental footprint than those that are produced, let's say, somewhere down in the south of Europe. Just one example. So I think it's very clear to have a holistic approach as to what local actually means, maintain the integrity of the internal market, definitely react to things that are clearly protectionist, or especially if they infringe the rules of the internal market, and inform consumers, because not disregard their clearly their demand for local and supporting local producers as well. So there should be a balance.
Great, thank you very much. And I believe Johan has a response to this question, which you'd like to share. Johan?
Yeah, Blaga, I think you're spot on. You're spot on with your observations. If you look at from a bakery industry point of view, and I think this is more a generic statement I want to make first, is a lot of trends which were before the pandemic have accelerated or are still there. And one of the trends we saw in our industry is that small artisanal bakers were struggling a little bit. And there's an opportunity, I would say, for the small artisanal bakers to not by protecting or by having protective measures, but still celebrate the locality and having local ingredients. So it's an opportunity for local bakers to do so, but without, let's say, the negative consequences like protection or telling things which are untrue. And I think Fedima can help there again. So we can help artisanal bakers to paint that picture, what is possible, what's not possible. So I see that as an opportunity for that sub-channel to really use this, let's say, pandemic to turn it into a more positive cycle.
Great, very interesting. I'd like to bring the conversation a bit back towards trade. and this protectionist measures, and see how Rob interprets it, because as we know, the US-EU trade relationship is a bit frosty in the last few years. So I was wondering what your take is on these potentially protectionist measures. Do you see some in the US? How is the US responding, and what is your take on the two blocs maybe prioritizing their local markets over global trade?
No, I think it's a great question. I think one of the issues that we all know in the food industry is the integrated supply chain, and it's a global supply chain, with ingredients coming all over the world. Even in the baking side, we see particularly, I think it's really important, a point I want to really reemphasize. So even here in the US, agriculture, the finished goods exports is the single largest export that we have in the United States in terms of our trade balance. It's a positive contributor. So it's a very strong sector, but a lot of that is built on a very sort of just-in-time supply chain where disruptions, due to weather or just issues with transportation and things like that, and Canada or China or Europe, can have an impact in terms of producing, bakery products and other products. I think one of the things that we're going to see is because of the changes and the challenges, frankly, of being able to get access to some of these ingredient products, especially, but also on the packaging side, is I think there's going to be a renewed effort to support more domestic supply chain sourcing, which is a different perspective for the United States, where we have been very open to trade, maybe not as much recently, shall we say, but we've been very open to trade. But I do think a lot of companies, just from a stability perspective, are looking at their own supply chains and seeing, okay, do I need to have a backup, or do I need to actually have a primary supply chain for this ingredient that's more domestically focused? So I think that's going to be something to watch very carefully. My greatest fear, though, is and totally understand the thinking behind it, but my greatest fear is that countries or sectors of the world will start to move towards more protectionist posture, and that's going to have enormous disruptions to the supply chain, which is only going to impact consumers at retail or at food service.
Very interesting, and a good end to bring in Els, now that you mentioned the retail and wholesale sector. Els, can you give us a European perspective on maybe the risks that you see in the internal market and in global trade in terms of potential protectionist measures post-COVID?
I absolutely agree, of course, with the protective measures are going to have a detrimental effect. That's absolutely clear. We really think trade can bring a lot of benefits, not only to Europe, but also to the partners, the trading partners across the world. So that's really something that we advocate for as well. On the local supply chains, I must say this is something which is, in some countries especially, very, very much demanded by consumers. So it's not across Europe for the same level everywhere, but there's a clear demand from consumers to get more local products and to get, to know where their products come from. And I think as retailers, you do play a strong role in providing that information where possible. It's really important, like I said, what does it mean local and where does it come from? But this trend is there, this ask for more information about the source of the products, and preferably local products is absolutely something that the retailer has to respond to. But it doesn't mean that you're only going to be providing that, because indeed we stand for the choice, and if there are local businesses or local suppliers that can be supported, or can even be supported by retailers to actually be marketed in other EU countries. I mean, this is something where we of course play a role in. But like I said, there is obviously a clear demand from consumers, and it is our role also to inform them what does it mean, and provide them with the information that they would be looking for.
Very interesting again. Now I'm going to turn to another question from the audience. This one's from Cyril Philo-Raboband, a member of the European Industrial Bakers Association, and she's got a two-part question for Johan here in the studio. Cyril would like to know, why are sales of bread products disappointing up until now, as one would expect, considering consumers might eat more bread at home. They say that they see this trend in the Netherlands, even in food retail. So, Johan, do you think bread sales will recover?
So the first thing I think in any economical crisis, and in a way, if you look at it, it's also an economical crisis, is that people will go to a more simplified basket of buying. So they will buy a less variety of products and they will buy cheaper products. So that means basically the absolute sales will go down. On top of that, of course, sales in food service is down, so therefore you see that less value is created in a way. So that's the first observation. If you then look at trends, if you look to bread, yes, there is a decline, but what we think and what we see is that bread will recover rather quickly. We see the recovery of other categories as sweet pastry and vinegary, also because they're more linked to special moments, to maybe more out of home. They will recover, but they will recover much slower. And of course, we need to realize that if we look long term, now forget about the pandemic, we as Fedima had this bread initiative. One of the reasons we have the bread initiative was we saw a step-by-step decline of bread, and we want to stop that. So we should realize that, again, as Fedima, we should say we need to tackle the challenges of the COVID crisis. But as industry and as Fedima, we need to keep on promoting bread, because we need to stop this, let's say, longer-term trend of decline. So that will be, let's say, the key elements.
Great, very interesting. I think it would be even more interesting to hear a bigger picture perspective and turn to Robb MacKie for his take on the bread sales in the bakery sales in the US, and if he thinks they'll recover and in what way.
So I think it's a little bit different story in that we have seen, certainly in the first 6-8 weeks of the pandemic, we saw bread sales at retail were up, 200% and 300%. That has clearly come back down, but it's settled in that year-over-year growth is up about 5 or 6%, depending on the products. One of the things that's happened is a number of the consolidation of SKUs. So the high volume products are continuing to be produced at higher levels. You're just not quite seeing the variety of products. And I think bakers are being very smart and working with their retail partners in terms of, if you're going to have added costs in terms of production and distribution to get into the marketplace, you're going to go with the higher volume products. So we've not seen, at least at retail, we've not seen the declines. What I can't tell you is because we don't have data yet, it's a little early, when you add the decline in food service, when you add the dip that happened with in-store bakery, and then you add the positive side, where are we kind of overall on bakery? It's still a little too early to tell, but at least at the retail side, sales have been up very significantly, and we don't see that changing, at least until people, again, getting to the psychological impact. We don't see that changing until, people start to feel more comfortable, going out and eating, going to events and traveling and things like that. So I think it's a bit of a different story here in the US.
Okay, very interesting. Next, we have another question from Hubert Bocquelet from SYFAB, a French National Association member of Fedima. He's saying that the bakery businesses and retail showed their reactivity. We also heard everyone mention resilience. And we've also heard people talk about consumer behavior changing and some opportunities. So how then do we distinguish between aligning to these new consumer trends from instant reaction to the crisis? I think that could be an interesting question for Blaga, in terms of the bigger picture. How do businesses stay agile in the context of an ongoing pandemic? Blaga, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Not an easy question, I would say. I think that, well, from a policy perspective, again, it's really important for business to have a stable framework and to be a little bit more prepared for future crises. I have not mentioned yet, but as part of the Farm to Fork strategy, which was also linked to COVID, we introduced an element on resilience and food security. And in fact, the Commission is looking at setting up something like a contingency plan so that we can ensure a more coordinated and prepared response to future crises. And this is obviously with the objective of getting businesses, operators, citizens more prepared, but also so that authorities can provide a more coordinated response and a more transparent and predictable framework for things to come in the future.
Okay, very interesting. And now maybe to see a retail perspective. Els, how do you think businesses can become more agile and flexible to deal with the immediate economic situation and then align to future consumer trends?
Yeah, it's indeed all about cooperation. I think to be agile, you need to know that you have a market, and I think it's really important. That was mentioned before as well, that there is, the retailers and the manufacturer relationship to make sure that what is selling, what is the real consumer demand, and this is what the retailer is, of course, very good at. I mean, you know what will sell. So there's a case there for continuing that close cooperation. But to be agile is, I mean, you have no choice. If you're not agile, if you don't adapt to the current to the market demand, I mean, then you're out of business. It's especially, of course, counts for retail. We don't have any contracts with our consumers. They can go to another store if they don't like what's on offer in one store. But it's, I think it should be in the DNA of every business. Not saying it's easy, like I mentioned before. You need to have some sort of, and I really concur with Blaga here that it's that the framework has to be clear. And in the farm to fork, I must say, indeed, there's a lot of things that are coming our way, and maybe it's not so clear for business what they can expect and where they need to go. So really, I think there is a bit of insecurity about where to go, and especially because the strategy is going to be rolled out over the next 3-4 years. You want to make sure that when you're agile in the right direction. We're talking about sustainability labeling and a sustainability framework with certain definitions and the roles of the different actors in the supply chain. It can be quite important to know as a business where you want to go to. So yes, on one hand, part of the DNA. On the other hand, we don't have a very stable framework for the moment. So again, I'm happy not to have my own business.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to bring the question back to the studio here to dig a bit deeper into the agility of the bakery sector and hear what some thoughts from you, Johan.
Yeah, I wrote down 3 elements. This crisis or this pandemic has, again, consumers ask themselves what is safe and what is not safe. And a key role as industry we need to play is to educate people on product safety. So when we earlier discussed enzymes, when we earlier discussed labeling as an industry, but also as an individual members, to give that transparency and that clarity will help to ensure, let's say a more relaxed marketplace. That's one element. The second element is e-commerce. What you see is those channels which were ready for e-commerce have flourished really, really well. And those channels which were a little bit more, let's say, not expecting it, like food service or maybe I'm exaggerating, but they struggle a little bit more. So the whole e-commerce is the whole trend of e-commerce is also coming to the food industry, and it will accelerate in the food industry. And all members in the industry and all members in the chain, I feel we need to prepare for that. And finally, is this whole sustainability challenge. We've been talking about this a few times, but I think it's still for our industry, it's a big mind shift to say how can we how can we make the whole supply chain more sustainable? How do we interact in the supply chain? And this is this is new to us, and we have the platforms for that, and as Svenima. But I feel there's still an opportunity as individual partners, as individual companies, as individual countries, but also in the total supply chain to really address that sustainability element.
Great, and I think again it'd be interesting to hear if the US is aligning to a similar shape of thinking. Yeah. Rob, would you echo most of those sentiments, or is there a different take in the US?
No, I think what I hear in conversations with bakers and the suppliers is everything is on the table. They're examining how they're producing product, how they're distributing product, where they're sourcing ingredients, in terms of everything is on the table, and how to be innovative going forward. Like we talked about earlier, we have this new, at least in the United States, we have this new opportunity with consumers around bakery products. How do we meet them, in a way that will continue to build on that growth of sales? And I think it's going to be a lot of the things that we talked about, clean label, health and wellness, sustainability, and those types of things. But I do think, in every conversation that I've had with the U.S. bakers, everything is on the table. They're looking to innovate. And I think Els said it absolutely right. It's good to be nimble, but you got to be nimble in the right direction. One of the things that we're doing as an association is we're trying to bring some of those learnings and some of those insights to the industry so that they can make informed, insightful decisions going forward. And so that's been kind of a new role for us. And it's something that we're embracing, is whether it's a retail focused baker or a food service baker, how do they be successful in this new environment?
Great. And before I get to the concluding remarks, I'd like to end on maybe a positive note and get the biggest opportunity in the foreseeable future for the bakery sector from each of the panelists. So maybe I could first turn to Blaga and ask her what she thinks is something really promising for European bakery companies coming forward.
Well, as was already mentioned, I think that bakery companies and the food businesses in general have to be very proud with the level of resilience that they have shown, and this new and even more positive perception of food business amongst all of us citizens has to be maintained. So the message would be really keep working closely with each other, but also relate to the consumer, use new channels to relate to the consumer, which can be digital, social media, and so on. Jump on the new opportunities, and as policymakers, we are also there to support you as much as we can.
Great, thank you very much. How about you, Els? Can you give us your one opportunity going forward?
I fully agree what Blaga says. I was almost going to say the same thing, but I would also like to refer to the role of associations and federations in bringing together the sector and sharing best practices. I think there is support needed for businesses to understand where to go. So on that part of the cooperation, but along the supply chain, is something that has to be maintained. We build on it at the crisis, and let's continue that. And indeed, on the other hand, the reappreciation of the sector, of the bakery sector, as well, of the home baking, and what we have seen, the real increase. There is a market there, and I think I think there are opportunities there to really capture that even more and going into the future.
Lovely. Now, Rob, can you tell us what you think is the most promising opportunity for the bakery sector in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I think I've touched on it a couple of times, Steve. It's really building on the momentum of that renewed connection with consumers across the board. We've never, certainly in my lifetime, we've not had this level of connection with consumers. And, even the sourdough experiments, I think, that we see all over the internet have shown that, having a professional baker has a lot of skill and talent. I would just also say, we should be very proud but humble about the fact that the one thing that consumers have been able to count on is a safe and healthy supply of food during the pandemic. And I just do not think that can be overstated. And so again, as Blaga talked about, we need to build on that. And then we need to work with our policy makers to help them better understand the challenges and work with us to remove some of those challenges and then build on some of the opportunities that are out there.
Great, very much. I think I'll ask Johan the same, if it'd be nice to get a European perspective.
Yeah, so a lot of things have been said, and I agree with all what you said, but we start also with this resilience of our team members, our employees. Rob, you said there was no interruption of supply chain, and I think if you look to that, we take that for granted, but in these kind of situations, it's good to realize that the food industry and the bakery industry had continuous supply. And also, and you mentioned that as well, is that associations will start to play will start to continue to play an important role to also educate their members. And as FEDIMA, one of the things we've done and we will start doing more is having round tables, either round tables with, let's say, the CEOs to really talk about what can we do as an industry, but also with our national associations. What have we learned? What can we do? What can we implement in the national association? So I see a lot of opportunity to network over, let's say, between our partners, but also in the whole supply chain.
Great, thank you very much. We're now to the conclusion of today's panel, and I'd just like to summarize with a couple of points that were discussed today to give you a bit of an overview of what we talked about. And just to echo the last sentiments, there's certainly gloom, but it's not all doom. COVID-19 has hit every sector, and bakery is no exception, but the market has shown resilience and has been able to feed Europeans and Americans all throughout this whole challenge. We also heard that consumer behavior is changing, which is creating some new opportunities, and that sustainability is not going away. It's not a buzzword anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time. The farm to fork strategy will certainly anchor sustainability in the food system for the next decade with its range of policies and measures. This will come with challenges like who will pay, but it also comes with more opportunities as consumers' increased demand for sustainability creates market opportunities. And then we also talked about trade. There are some risks of protectionist measures, and to overcome them, collaboration will be key. But with that comes a greater chance to share the value of the marketplace and benefit, and then take advantage of emerging consumer behavior. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, those in the studio and those at home, and the audience for your questions. I think it provided for a very interesting, lively debate, and we ticked all the important boxes, I feel. And with that, I'll pass the floor to Johan to close this webinar. Thank you.
So yes, this was a weird General Assembly. This is the first time we do this virtual. I think we all miss the social part of a General Assembly, the interaction we normally have during a dinner, during the breaks. I still feel that with this format, we've given you a flavor of what FEDIMA has achieved this year, but also created a platform for us to interact on trends. So having said that, so again, I think this was a great experience, but I would love to hear your feedback on this. I would like to thank all the participants, the panelists, Blaga, Els, Rob, for your participations, Rob, for your early wake up. I know how difficult that is. I also would like to thank all the committee chairs for their presentations on our progress. And finally, Steve, I want to thank you, but also people from the FEDIMA Secretariat. This was a whole new experience. It took some considerable work to set it up. I think it went smoothly, so I want to thank them as well. So tomorrow we will have an advisory board with the CEOs and the committee meetings. And finally, in November, we have the sustainability webinar. And I think as long as the pandemic is there, and maybe even beyond, we will use this kind of way of interacting with you more and more. And I hope to see you then at least all at the sustainability webinar in November. So thank you.